This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Farha Ternikar. Farha Ternikar is the Director of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at Moyne College in Syracuse, New York, where she teaches courses in feminist theory, race, gender, and pop culture. In this episode, we discuss her current manuscript, Faith and Food Networks, Muslim Women's Acts of Resistance and Resilience in the American Diaspora, as well as the articles Constructing the Halal Kitchen in the American Diaspora and Where is the Place for Muslim Feminists? There are links to several readings in the show notes of this episode, so check those out if you like what you hear. Thanks so much for listening as always, and please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Farha Ternikar. Dr. Farha Ternikar, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Good morning.
I'm so glad that you're here. I am wondering if we can kick this off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. I'm currently in Syracuse, New York at Moyne College, and I'm the Director of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at Moyne College. I'm also a professor of sociology, and I teach on feminist theory, Muslim women in America, race, class, gender, pop culture, and sociology.
Wonderful. I'm wondering if there's like an interesting backstory, because that's a lot of really cool different areas that kind of straddle a lot of different academic realms, but also some stuff that's really relevant to just people who enjoy pop culture in general in like our normal everyday lives. How did you nail down your areas of academic expertise over the years? Like, is there a cool story there?
Maybe kind of. So, I mean, like many people, I was confused when I was a freshman in college. So I decided to major in English because English was my favorite subject in high school. And I wanted to, study American literature, specifically women's writers. But I just felt at the time I didn't go on with English because I felt like at the time the graduate programs were not diverse enough for what I wanted to do. So then after that, I actually took a job at a private high school teaching English for 2 years. And that's when I decided I really wanted to study women and religion. And so then I got a master's in religious studies. And my master's thesis advisor, I asked her about going on for a Ph.D. in religious studies. And she actually said, don't get a Ph.D. in religious studies to me. At the time, she was like, what you want to do is really intersectional because I'm really interested in lived religion, not just ideology. And so she actually recommended sociology. And at that time, intersectionality was just taking off. So I didn't want to study kind of religion by itself. I really wanted to think about, when I think about lived religion of Muslim women in the United States and North America, how does religion really intersect with race, class, and gender? And for me, talking about race has always been really important. And so sociology, really owns critical race theory in a lot of ways. I would say you can trace intersectionality to Patricia Hill Collins in sociology as well as Kimberly Crenshaw. And so thinking about American Muslims has always been something that I've been interested in, when I did my master's in religious studies and I came to sociology. But once I got tenured in sociology, I was even looking for something even more because I'm an American raised Muslim American woman. And I really was missing kind of like this global lens. And so that's kind of after tenure, I started pivoting to looking at transnational feminist analysis of Muslim women and making those connections between what's going on in the United States, what's going on in Pakistan, Palestine, other places. And so now when I talk about myself as a scholar, I think of myself as a scholar who studies Muslim women in America with a transnational and intersectional lens. really through everyday things. Though when I say everyday things, I'm interested in not necessarily always like these macro level analyses, like why do Muslim women buy what they buy, read what they read, eat what they eat.
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in your kind of scholarship too, because when my personal interest in religion, it's like, what can I see when I'm going around my city, right? I want to know what's going on like right now. The history of it all is super interesting to me, and how we got to where we are is super interesting to me. But walking around and being able to understand my surroundings is by far my highest priority for like understanding religion and society today, and how that like impacts social decisions and like politics and policy and the ways that people interact with each other in their own neighborhoods. So I love what you do because it seems like you are kind of catering to me as a person as with my interests. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, and one of the things I'm interested in both sociology and women's studies approach to studying Muslim women is making it more layered and nuanced, but also trying to understand like what's going on at the moment, what's going on in front of you as well, using those frames. And so if it's looking at like after the last election, how we're thinking about, policies that might affect Muslims in America, but also like visual culture, right? I'm also, whenever I walk into a room, I always notice, how are people dressed? Even when I teach my pop culture class, we often do a unit on shoes and, thinking about like what made my student have that decision to wear those Nikes and not the Adidas. What does
Yeah.
that say about you? Or modest fashion, why is that type of hijab worn instead of another?
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about a variety of your projects. I want to start with something completely normal that everybody in the world is involved in, and people maybe think about to varying degrees, and that's food. You sent me a piece of reading that I really enjoy called Faith and Food Networks: Muslim Women's Acts of Resistance and Resilience in the American Diaspora. And you also sent me another article called Constructing the Halal Kitchen in the American Diaspora. Tell me a little bit about your origin of interest in food as an academic discipline before we get into a couple of the terms and the specifics of these articles.
Okay, so two quick things. Faith and Food Networks, Muslim Women's Act of Resistance and Resilience in the American Diaspora, is a small piece of my next book, which is under contract with Ohio Press. And so that's a small chunk of that. But getting back to your question, why food, right? So one of the things I really wanted to do is actually move away from hijab as like a symbol of Muslim women, right? Because there's been so much work already on modest fashion and hijab. I mean, one of my first publications out of grad school was looking at modesty norms and the Abrahamic traditions, kind of comparing them. And so I wanted to kind of move away from hijab as a signifier of Muslim women. And I wanted to really complicate how we can think about Muslim immigrant women and look at food as like a mode of analysis in terms of thinking about how Muslim women kind of create both community, but also, how food is also part of religious identity as well as has a racial, cultural, and gendered aspects to it. And so that's why I chose food kind of like to zero in on in terms of this particular project that I'm working on now.
Cool. The article uses the term food ways, which I think came up whenever I did an article or an episode with Ben Zeller and Nora Rubel a couple of years back. But I wonder if you can just kind of describe that term for me, food way. What does that mean, and how does it fit into your work?
Yeah, I know Nora Rubel's work well, actually on Jewish food, right? And so, I mean, food waste can, and I think it has different connotations in food studies versus religious studies. But when I think about food waste, I think about how it is a mechanism for understanding the role of food and building a community, but also specifically in religion, also reinforcing norms, sometimes dietary restrictions, as well as codes for how food is often looked at as a way to understand like insider and outsider status in religious communities. And so, I mean, there are some really interesting parallels in terms of studying halal food in the US versus kosher food in the US. And I think a lot of the scholarship that Jewish scholars or scholars in Judaism that are doing on food is actually really interesting as well.
You write that religion frames food consumption for Muslim South Asian American immigrants post 9/11 which really to me captures like the resilience and resistance aspect in the subtitle of the book project. Tell me a little bit about the title, because those terms like resistance, resilience, they really jump out at me.
Yeah, so this book is based on observations and participant observations in a Muslim community in Florida, right? And so I really think like Florida becomes its own character, right?
Yes.
I think we can all agree in the United States that Florida is its own character, right? Weird
I'm so
Florida
happy
man.
about this.
So it's really so when it's funny because I didn't think it would turn into a book, and I talked to a couple of different editors, including one who edits for a Southern food series, and she's like, "Why wouldn't Florida be part of Southern food?" And I'm like, "Because Florida is its own thing, right?"
It's its own country,
But
basically.
yeah, for sure, right? And so Florida is the backdrop of this next book, right? And so I'm really interested specifically on how by these Muslim women and that I'm talking to specifically in Tampa, Florida, by how they cook and share halal food, Muslim immigrant women are resisting oppressive regimes, but also exhibit resilience. And I can talk a little bit more of that. But I started these conversations and this a participant observation really with this group of Muslim women in Florida, who have survived a Trump presidency, right, and continue to resist under DeSantis as governor, right? So politics, Florida are always kind of the backdrop of this project. And what I find fascinating is that these Muslim women, they don't change what they do, how they dress, what they eat, right? And so they're not intimidated by DeSantis, we're not intimidated by Trump. So I argue that through sharing halal food, organizing potlucks in Ramadan when they're fasting, hosting these elaborate Eid feasts, I see how Muslim women not only represent resistance and resilience, but they also represent Muslim women's joy. And I think that's something that is also missing in a lot of the analysis that I see. Not enough analysis looking at food in terms of how is that a way for Muslim women to create community, resist, and be resilient, but then also not enough work on Muslim women and joy. This idea that, like, yeah, we often hear food is love, but also, how is food also joy for a group that has, continues to be targeted, right? Continues to be highly surveilled, right? And what's interesting to me is that this group of Muslim women, they are just not, they just continue to do what they do. They're not affected. They continue to go to the mosque. They continue to host these meals. They have open houses to non-Muslims through food, right? At the mosque, they're like, we're having an open house. We would welcome, congregants from the local churches and synagogues. Come and share our food. Come and share our stories.
Yeah. Well, why Tampa?
So Tampa, because I have a connection to Tampa.
Sweet.
So yeah, so I'm actually was raised in Florida, so I have like really strong connections. I actually did my master's degree at the University of South Florida, so I have connections both in terms of like the larger community, and when I think about doing research with a community that is largely marginalized, I think it's really important to have trust. I did my dissertation research in Chicago, where I worked years to gain trust of like various different immigrant communities there. But because I already have trust there, it's easier for me to get entry into these spaces.
Hmm.
I have what I call insider outsider status because I am Muslim and I am South Asian, and I grew up in Florida. Though I don't know everyone that I'm necessarily talking to or in conversation with very well, I know many people in the network there, and so there's an ease because there's a level of trust and comfort. But I also think when you say why Tampa or why Florida, Florida is a very incredibly diverse state, especially when you look at Central and South Florida. So Tampa has more than 5 mosques, more than several full-time Muslim schools, like, that go from kindergarten to high school. It has a really diverse Muslim population, South Asian, Black Muslim, Palestinian, as well as converts. And so there's actually a lot of racial, ethnic, and class diversity in terms of the Muslim community in Tampa. And I think, these Muslim communities in the South, I think are unique in some ways. And
Hmm.
so that's why, Tampa, I have a connection there, but also it's just a really rich city. It's a city that's had a historical Democratic mayor for many years as well, and a largely Republican state. And so that's also, interesting to me.
Yeah. When you're at these these gatherings where the women are that you are, like talking about and writing about and working with for the book, what are the conversations like? Is it like political? Is it just like talking about families and it's just like totally banal normal stuff? Like what are those conversations like in these groups that you're getting together with?
I mean, they're all over the place, right? Sometimes one of these meals that I'm invited to will just be about how are their grandchildren doing, right? Because actually the groups that I'm actually focusing in on are like these women in their 70s largely. And so
Mm,
they so many of them have grandchildren, all of them have children, many of them have grandchildren, many of them have been widowed. And so I'm also interested, like one chapter of the book is on Muslim women and widowhood, actually. And there's very little research. I've been in conversation with Professor Keisha Ali about some of that work. And so, yeah, so sometimes it's about grandchildren and, just like everyday things, but other times politics come up. Like Trump has come up, the election comes up. In my last visit, they were asking me actually what I thought about Kamala Harris, and so they're thinking, they're carefully thinking about who they're going to vote for. I would say politics don't always come up, but they don't shy away when they do.
yeah.
I think also when they're in a group where they're with their friends and their community, they're not afraid to kind of share their ideas about politics.
Mm. Well, tell me a little bit about the maintenance of authenticity and identity, because you say that foodways maintain authenticity and identity in the life of an immigrant Muslim woman. What does that mean?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I say food maintains authenticity, but because as a sociologist, I would say authenticity is a social construction, right?
Mm,
So what I argue in the book is that what these women are doing in terms of Muslim community and halal food is maybe not always seen as authentic to outsiders, but it's what Meredith Abarca, who works on Mexican women in food in Texas, would say it's original. So I make that argument because when these women are making their halal chicken biryani for their grandkids or their friends, they might not be cooking from scratch, right? And so when I talk to like some of my like middle class foodie professors about this idea that does it have to be from scratch to be authentic, right? And
mm,
where so many, I think both, and we see this in terms of food scholars, but also people that call themselves foodie, when we're trying to track down that authentic recipe of your great grandmother's Italian pasta or your aunt's I don't know, Romanian dish that's been
sure.
passed on, it has to be from scratch. And so I argue that some of these recipes are actually not from scratch. They are also going to the Indian grocery store and buying the shan masala and then coming home and it's semi homemade but cooking it with halal chicken, right? So it's still halal, and I would argue it's original. Maybe it wouldn't be seen as authentic, but if an immigrant is recreating a recipe from the homeland in their own way, I would say they have that agency and autonomy to create it in an original way, right? And so that for second and third generation Muslim women, you could argue is authentic, right? So it's a lot, of like pushing back between like what are we seeing in these mass produced like cookbooks that have Pakistani food or South Asian food, versus what are home cooks really cooking, right? And kind of giving them, I think, an important role and how to define Muslim foodways, right? And
Yeah.
Muslim women creating in what they make in the house, I would argue, is a certain kind of knowledge production that
Mm.
pushes back from this, like both pushing back against academia as well as like the cookbook industry.
So social class comes up in your work as well in the food writing that you do. Tell me a little bit about your understanding of how food contributes to an understanding of social class.
Sure. So I mean, in food, I mean, classes come up even in my earlier work on hijab and modesty norms, and it continues to come up when I talk to Muslim women about food because you see some of the same trends that you see amongst the middle class, right? So specifically buying organic ingredients, right? And so one of the women in this group only buys organic vegetables, and when I ask her why, she says, she thinks they're better for us, right? And so like I have to just hold back because I don't necessarily think think that. But if you want to buy all your vegetables from Whole Foods, great. Organic Whole Foods. One of the women talked about going to a farmer's market at least once a month to buy local, right? And of course, it's wonderful to buy local and support local farmers, but it's interesting because I would argue that's a manifestation of class. Because if I was doing this project with newer Muslim immigrants that are working class, I would not necessarily see them buying organic or local, right? It's more like we need to get food on the table for dinner, and maybe our groceries are from Super Walmart, right? And so there's also like some judgment that can go on with this as well. So I would say we see class in terms of thinking about buying organic, buying local, being mindful of things like animal rights, right? If some of that, all the women that I've been talking to buy only halal meat, but one of them talked about looking for halal meat that's also cruelty free, right? Looking at that as well. And so, so that's interesting because a lot of these, the food politics that I think those of us that are middle class are aware of, we see also an awareness in like the immigrant Muslim community as well.
Yeah, and I don't know anything about how difficult it is to, maintain a halal kitchen. That's not something that I personally have ever done. I'm wondering if
Right.
you can tell me a little bit about what's challenging for creating a halal kitchen for immigrant women in the US specifically, because I'd imagine it's easier elsewhere, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, having a halal kitchen is different than having a kosher kitchen. There's actually not as many, I would say, stipulations to that. When I say that that article about maintaining a halal kitchen, what I'm really talking about is how Muslim women thinking about a halal kitchen is not just about having only buying halal products, because many items, not just I'm thinking about meat, right? Only buying halal meat, but many items that have gelatin in their ingredients is often seen as like haram, not acceptable. Is that translation of that? And so avoiding products that might have gelatin, like making sure that like if you're buying candy for your kids, like marshmallows, jelly beans often have like gelatin or pork products, so avoiding those as ingredients, observing dietary restrictions like pork, alcohol, gelatin, but in terms of like methods and how people cook in the kitchen, there are not that many rules about like mixing food there the way there is in terms of like kosher cuisine. So I would say it's easier than maintaining maybe a kosher kitchen. The biggest challenge would have been like historically before the 1980s, when there weren't as many halal food markets in major cities. But because now Tampa has like a really large Muslim population, there's multiple grocery stores, meat markets, halal butchers there as well. So maintaining a halal kitchen, I would say, is really about, avoiding the foods that are not, permissible, avoiding haram products, specifically ingredients that have gelatin, pork products, alcohol. And there's some variation in terms of how some of these dietary restrictions and norms are interpreted as well.
I know that you have other interests as well. You've brought up fashion several times, and I know that you and I have chatted a little bit off the recording about your interests in like pop culture and entertainment too. So I'm wondering if we can move into something else you've written about. You have another piece that you sent me called "Beyond Hijab and Modest Fashion: Muslim American Women's Negotiations of Wardrobes and Identities." Tell me a little bit about the backstory of this particular piece.
Sure. Well, I decided to write that piece. It's one of the pieces I believe I wrote during COVID, because I had just started watching We Are Lady Parts, Miss Marvel, and sort of three shows that all have depict Muslim women in very different ways, right? We Are Lady Parts is a British sitcom, sort of. It's Canadian. Miss Marvel, right? A superhero, first Pakistani Muslim superhero, yeah, US show. And so I was thinking about, and I was thinking about at the same time I was writing this, and based on my own research with Muslim women in the US, I was just thinking also about the ways that we have started to see changes in how Muslim women are represented in television and movies as well. And so I wrote this during COVID, really kind of blending together what I had done in terms of ethnographic research, but also thinking about what I was watching, and so it's kind of one of those moments, like many of us, I was stuck at home and not interacting with a lot of people. And so I wasn't necessarily going out and doing a new project, but I was consuming a lot of television.
Mm. And this is good too because I actually haven't seen any of these shows. Like whenever I think back on like the COVID era, I was watching like Rami and shows
Oh,
like
yes.
that.
Yep.
So this is amazing. So I'm wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about how entertainment compares now for representation compared to like when you were growing up. Like what do you remember about these two different eras and how things are changing over time?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in the 80s. And so, like, I watched most of the shows I watched depicted white middle class families, right? So, Who's the Boss, Family Ties, Growing Pains. Then I saw a little bit of a shift in the 1990s, which shows what a different world, what with Lisa Bonet, what premiered in 1987. So, like, I really feel like 1990 something happened. At least there was like this burst of shows like A Different World and Living Single. And then in grad school, I was kind of back to watching predominantly white shows. Like I mean, I will go lowbrow and highbrow. So I just totally like digested shows like the Gilmore Girls, Gossip Girls, HBO's Girls. And
Yeah.
so I went through this period of, really thinking about the representation of girls and American sitcoms. And then I think, by like the late 2000s we started seeing a shift. I think there are shows like Insecure with Issa Rae. I think that are really, really important. And then other shows that had more representation of women of color in particular, that came around the same time as Insecure, like Harlem and the 20s, that I think are also really important in terms of representation of Black women. And then, then it seemed like they kind of overlapped for me, at least during COVID, when I picked up on watching Sort of on HBO, which I think is really important, not only because there's diverse representations of Pakistani Canadian women. Some are Muslim, some are not Muslim, but also having the first character that I've seen that is from a Pakistani Muslim family that is non-gender conforming. And so
Hmm.
I think Sort of, which is kind of like under the radar because I think maybe it was on only on HBO Max. I think is really challenging a lot in terms of when we think about the representation of Pakistani Canadians as well as Muslim Americans, Muslim North Americans. And I think we saw more press come out about We Are Lady Parts and Miss Marvel for different reasons. We Are Lady Parts because it is this British show that represents, an all Muslim women's punk rock band essentially, right? And every woman in that band really displays modesty in a very different way. One of them doesn't wear hijab at all. One of them is wearing burqa, niqab. One of them was wearing hijab. And so it's like really diverse. And this idea of, a Muslim punk band that's all Muslim women is also like, I think really just challenges everybody's ideas of what they think about when they think about Muslim women. And then, of course, Miss Marvel was huge, I think, for superhero comic books. Before the show came out, the comic book came out, and this idea that we could have a Muslim superhero, a Pakistani superhero. I think Miss Marvel, the show in particular, is really important in terms of thinking about visual analysis, not only because the character of Miss Marvel doesn't wear hijab, she still dresses modestly, right? She's not wearing a Wonder Woman outfit, right? We can really juxtapose was Wonder Woman 1984, what kind of costume was that versus look at Miss Marvel's costume. She's not wearing hijab, but it's still a modest outfit. And then the character who plays her best friend is wearing hijab. And I think that's really important. This idea that in the same universe, you can have women who wear hijab and women who don't wear hijab, but still dress modestly, And so I think all three of those shows are ripe for like new analyses and think in terms of thinking about Muslim women's representation in Western media in particular.
Yeah, well, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on what are some of the biggest developments or changes you're seeing among wardrobe? Because, like, I read Liz Buchar's book, Pious Fashion, and talked to her about that. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me about some of the stuff that you're noticing with regards to like wardrobe choices just in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's at least two themes in terms of what I'm observing. Well, first of all, right, there's just such incredible diversity because Muslim women in the US, Canada, North America are so diverse. So you're just seeing a lot of diversity in terms of how modest fashion is really Muslim women really own it in a particular way and make it their own, depending on their cultural, ethnic background, depending on, how religious they are. So I think the diversity in modest fashion is just constantly evolving, right? And the second piece of this, which I think is really interesting, which I think there are several grad students working on this now, is modest fashion beyond clothing and thinking about jewelry, cosmetics, right? There's now something called halal nail polish,
Mm.
and so even in terms of the decisions that young Muslim women make, young American Muslim women make, in terms of if they wear makeup or don't wear makeup, how does that play into, physical displays of modesty? The same thing with jewelry. And so those are things that I think are also important. And then also like, larger global politics in terms of how Muslim women dress, right? Who's wearing the keffiyeh, who's not wearing the keffiyeh is something we could think about. Is it okay to be wearing the keffiyeh if you're not Palestinian? Are we appropriating? Also, other politics. When I was doing some visual analysis, I looked at social media influencers, and one of my chapters of my first book in 2021, Intersectionality in Muslim Women. And when I was looking at media influencers, I really looked at like Muslim fashionistas, and I looked at how they were using fashion to really signify their support for both Palestine, but also Black Lives Matter, right? I mean, thinking about T-shirts, but then also thinking about, beyond the keffiyeh, thinking about like what kinds of necklaces do we wear, what kinds of charms do we wear, right? And noticing when that charm around your neck is Palestine or Pakistan or Bangladesh, and so, I mean, so it's so complicated because Muslim women are so diverse, right? And so for me, when I started, looking at social media in terms of thinking about modest fashion, I was really actually more drawn to thinking about politics and fashion around Black Lives Matter and Palestine, actually even more than modesty, because I think fashion is really an interesting way to display your politics. I even think back to sports, as little as I am invested, and thinking about, the sneakers that basketball players wore that had Black Lives Matters on them, so I'm always kind of thinking about, ways that Muslim women kind of like disrupt and challenge our hegemonic ideas about fashion through the ways that they have this, they own it. They have this agency, autonomy in terms of making us think about politics in ways that we might not have been before.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the keffiyeh. I know that you've been writing about Palestine too recently. Is there anywhere that you would draw people's attention to for your work on that topic if you wanted to promote any other work that you've done in that area? Because we're in
Yes,
like the
well,
10th month of this war right now. And so I just wanted you to be able to comment on that if you felt like it.
yeah. So first of all, I'm an Indian Muslim scholar. So for me, any work I do on Palestine, it's centering my Palestinian sisters. So I want to give a shout out to a couple of junior scholars working on Palestine. My latest piece that just came out on where is the place for Muslim women in the academy is co-authored with two junior Palestinian scholars, Wafa Hassan, who's a Palestinian scholar activist at University of Toronto. If you're not following her, you should. She's a Muslim and Palestinian scholar, and a younger Palestinian scholar activist, Basan Jabr, who just finished her grad work at Georgetown. And I always tell everyone I learned about my feminism from Black women. I learned activism from Palestinian Muslim women,
Mm.
and a third scholar that has really inspired me, also Palestinian Muslim scholar, Donna Alwan. And so, any work I do on Palestine is in community with them. And I think for me, applying a transnational lens in my feminist praxis must center their voices and not center my own, even though I'm Muslim. And that, that's something I think a lot of scholars struggle with, is we want to uplift those that are actually, really part of the struggle and not take away from them, when we have, because I think about the ways that I'm privileged as a US citizen, as middle class, as a tenured professor.
Yeah. Well, I'll put some links for some of these pieces in the show notes for listeners out there who may be wanting to look at some of the things that we have talked about in the last little bit. Tell me a little bit about your view on public scholarship and getting yourself and your work out there for as wide of an audience as you possibly can.
Sure. So for me, public scholarship, I was really kind of conflicted about it, and when I first heard about trying to do some public scholarship. But one of the positives is I think getting your work out to a broader audience, because those of us that are academics working at universities, when we publish something, sometimes we realize that maybe only 50 people will read your peer reviewed journal article that you worked on for 4 years, right? And wouldn't it be better to take that piece and make it more accessible? So rather than only 50 academics or graduate students reading your work, maybe like 500 people would read it if you published it in an open access blog or online or through a podcast. So I think for me at this particular moment, public scholarship is important because of where we are as a country, not only how divided we are, but what's going on in the world. And as a Muslim scholar, how can I help people to maybe better understand, or also how can I help maybe even just share resources with others who are interested in doing work on Muslim women or interested in solidarity work. If I can share what I know to help, these larger social justice causes to more people than just academics, because I think a lot of people doing the really tough work around this are not academics. Actually, there
Hmm.
are like regular people in your neighborhood, in your community, and I have a lot of respect for folks that are actually not academics.
Do you feel nervous at all working in some of these areas that you do?
Yes. And so I think that I always think about the risks. I have a lot to say about this because I'm a visible minority. I'm not white and I'm also Muslim. And I have signed a lot of the petitions supporting Palestine even before October 7th. So I've shared this with some of the folks in sacred rights that I think specifically for women of color and Muslim, as well as Jewish scholars, there are often risks, putting yourself out there. There are going to be people that disagree with you, both within academia and outside of academia, right? Because sometimes I'm sharing a position that's not popular. I'm doing research that maybe somebody doesn't agree with, also because my scholarship is now political. When I was a younger scholar, it wasn't as political. And so even though I've been doing a lot of this work, outside of academia. And so I think there is a risk. I mean, you could get, everything from getting hate mail to even be targeted by students, faculty, administrators, and folks in the community.
Yeah. Well, where can people find you if they want to follow along with what you've got going on? Because your pieces are really cool, and I'm loving reading the variety of stuff that you put out, from pop culture to fashion to food. It's really great to see. Where can people find you if they want to follow
Sure.
along?
So I'm on Twitter and my handle is at capital F, lowercase AR, capital B, my middle name, ANO. So I can say that again, at capital FAR, capital BANO, or maybe on, I guess, what is it, X, not Twitter. You can probably just search Dr. Farha Ternikar. I'm also on LinkedIn, just under my name, Farha Ternikar, Ternikar. I'm also on Instagram, but I don't really have like a normal public account on Instagram. I usually I have a lot of privacy settings, so I usually use Instagram with my students or people that I know in person.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Farah Ternikar, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas and chatting with me about fashion, food, the lives of Muslim women, some issues around the war with in Gaza. I really appreciate your time and your energy for being here. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I really enjoyed being in conversation with you.